welcome again to Planet Product Owner. This is your host, Scott. So sorry that it's been a little while since I've been back with you. Been dealing with this thing called Hurricane Sally. We're all okay down here. Took a lot of damage to the Gulf Coast, but hey, we're really fortunate. Blessed beyond measure, they say. So today's topic, and again, I'm woefully sorry that I haven't spent much time recording episodes, but I have been working kind of behind the scenes on some other things that I think you're going to like. But today I have one of my favorite things to do. It's a question from a listener. Now, as you know, I've talked about some things from listeners that they've asked questions about, and rather than specifically answering, I guess, the question at hand, what I want to do is make sure that I'm covering a little bit of background, around the question too, because again, everybody's on a different part of this journey, right? And so, if you're new to this podcast, if you're new to this forum or this journey, really what we're trying to do here on this podcast is share thinking patterns about Agile so that we can learn how to work better. That's really what it's about. We put it on a third grade level. I've noticed that the listens have gone up dramatically, and that's probably because you're sharing it. Again, I don't advertise this very much. I don't market it very well. I don't market myself very well either, which, hey, that's okay. I don't really have to, right? But in any event, today's topic is going to really center around maybe a new product owner coming to the role from another role. We just had an episode about a QA analyst, and could they become a product owner? And the answer is sure. But there's a few things that you got to kind of let go of, and there's a few things that you got to kind of adopt and work within to become that product owner. Now, I did have a business analyst who had asked me about, becoming a product owner, but it wasn't just sliding over into a product owner role. This was more in line with, hey, I'm coming from like a single team, a single scrum, a single development initiative or what have you. And what I'm moving into is a product owner role in a framework like SAFe. So, you're in luck today if you are a SAFe practitioner, if you've got the cert, if you're doing the thing, that's great. You're in luck today. If you are a listener who is new to SAFe, or you have been working from a background of just having a single development kind of initiative thing, or a single project type, solution type mindset, and you're going into a SAFe organization where they've implemented some scaled Agile, that's what today's topic is going to be centered around. And so this episode is primarily geared towards product owners, I guess, but I'm going to try to use the lens of a product owner as much as I can. But I also think that Scrum Masters and team members alike would enjoy this topic today. Obviously, if you're an organizational leader, I think I'm getting more and more of those folks join into the cast, so that's great. And I really appreciate your time in listening. And today's episode is, of course, brought to you by the Feed Scott Fund, and you can find my Venmo and Cash App IDs on the details of the podcast. And thank you all who have contributed so far. It's very helpful and very thoughtful. I appreciate it. Not begging, but just a nice gesture. Okay, so let's get into today's topic and get to the planet. First, what I want you to understand is not just what to expect when you're coming from a single platform or a single solution or a single development initiative type environment where you came from as being a product owner. I do want to talk to you a little bit about what to expect, but before I do that, I have to explain to you why an organization would go to a scaled Agile framework in some kind of capacity, right? So you're coming from kind of this small scale into this larger scale, all right? The reason that we scale Agile is because we have built some kind of business case that says, hey, we need more than one team working within a platform or within a solution or a suite of solutions at one time. That's really the justification for scaling Agile. We could also have the need to have multiple solutions working together, or even potentially releasing together to complement or supplement each other's work. A lot of times these systems or products reach similar audiences, or they do similar things Maybe it's just a different delivery method or interface to the users. So you'll find a lot of times in like digital spaces, you'll find a lot of scaled agile business case and implementation there. There's a few things that you're going to have to know about a product owner about being a product owner in a scaled agile implementation, I guess, before you dive into that role within SAFe. And typically SAFe is found again in the much larger organizations. And if it's executed well, it works great. And if it's not executed very well, I'll let you be the judge of that. I'll save judgment. I'll let you handle that part. So first, let's start with some basic terminology and see what you know about it so far. So when we talk about epics, features, epic owners, feature owners, enablers, enabler owners, spikes, release train engineer, backlog, WSJF or WSJF as they call it, program increments or PIs, PI planning, inspect and adapt. You've heard a lot about those topics from me kind of over the course of the previous episodes. I've touched on a lot of it in different areas. And so the idea here is that we attach these names and these terms to concepts or things or processes or whatever so that we can all get on the same page. I've told you about domain language. I've told you about team language, and we talked about that a lot before. So as long as we're all using the term epic as a representation of some high-level strategic theme to which we could attach one or more features, and each of those features have multiple stories that help you reach the objective of that feature, then we're all talking about the same thing. And a lot of times, again, I talk about epic being kind of more at the portfolio level, feature being more at the program level, and stories being more at the team level. So when you think about those strategic themes or goals, that would represent your epic. Your feature would really represent more of the objective that you're trying to reach to support the epic. And then your stories, obviously, are what you would write and execute on to fulfill the feature. So, all right, we got all that, right? So I think that kind of makes sense, I hope anyway. So when you're scaling up into a scaled agile environment, really what you're doing is you're taking your current microcosm of having your single development initiative or your single project mindset initiative, and you're scaling that up. Now your microcosm becomes part of the macrocosm. That's really how it works. Now, in order to scale up, SAFe, namely SAFe, and I've worked in SAFe before, obviously. I've gotten some certifications in SAFe. Yay, hooray me. They've put out some different configurations that we'll talk about today, and I'm only really going to touch on them, but I do think it's great for you to have the highlights of that. Your organization is likely going to walk you through some certifications and some training and things like that, which is great, but giving you the highlights of kind of what most large organizations use. Most of them, and they're different configurations, by the way, but Portfolio SAFe is typically what you would find. It's just a configuration type for each of these kind of components that we break down. So we talk about portfolio, and I want you to think about your epics here. Think of that as your strategic theme or your really large effort or your goals that may be coming from like executive management, actually. So for example, we want to grow our engagement from X percent to Y percent over the next year, right? That's a really big idea, okay? It's a really big strategic theme and a goal that we have, okay? Now, when you step down from the portfolio level and you look at the program level, which is just under the portfolio, I want you to think of this as kind of the brain trust behind how to reach the goal, of growth or engagement or whatever that number is, okay? And there could be many things that we could do. There's a lot of different options, a lot of different things that this brain trust can kind of get together and assimilate into in order to help us achieve that larger goal. So this is kind of where everybody comes up with the ideas at the program level. The program level really represents the generated ideas, which we would typically refer to as features, okay, to help us reach those goals at the portfolio level. So portfolio, epic, program, feature, okay. Finally, we get down to the team level. So these three levels, I guess, or components, I guess, of the configuration type for Portfolio SAFe include portfolio, program, and then team. Team, this is where we have a lot of execution taking place. This is where the product owner primarily fits in. So if you're new to the game, you're new to the role, you're typically going to fit into the team level. But now, I want you to keep in mind, new product owner, you can also span across the program level as well. Not often are you going to be involved with the portfolio level, which is great. Leave that to the suits and the folks that are trying to lead the organization. What you're really wanting to do is capitalize on their problems or their opportunities, and you're wanting to make sure that your team is focusing on your thing, and your thing is still maximizing the value of what the team is doing. But you're doing it now within your microcosm, okay? Now, you have a little bit of a difference now in your microcosm, okay? So your new microcosm is typically influenced, dependent upon, or even a predecessor to the rest of those teams that are in your train. I said train. Wow, that's a new term, right? What is a train? I'm not talking about the kind of train that ravaged my little Gulf Coast town last week. Let's talk about the train in the next segment a little bit more. But before we leave this segment, I want to recap just to make sure that you've kind of got this. You have some basic terminology here. There's a configuration set up within SAFe. Typically, you would find that portfolio configuration there so that you have portfolio, program, and team. Each of those levels, so to speak, first there's a tie between all of those, or some traceability between those to making sure that we're on the right track, that we're playing on the same sheet of music. We adopt this terminology. We make sure we're running it right. And that's kind of a learning curve for you, but I want you to be aware that each organization implements it somewhat differently down the line. So while I would like to say there's a one-size-fits-all, there's really not. There's a lot of house rules that come into play, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, you got some basic terminology, what each one of these things mean, why maybe we scale Agile, okay? And at least you got that from a high level. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. You just came from an organization or a role where you were primarily the Agilist or the product owner, right? You were the product owner, man. You were really kind of calling the shots because you just really had your team or an extension of your team working together. And since you were running the show, and I don't mean that in a boss kind of way, we've talked about that before, but in a leader kind of way, you had a really solid leadership role in that since you were the product owner and you were doing this single development initiative or this single project mindset kind of thing. You got your wits about you, right? You got kind of your own way of doing things, which is great. There's good news and there's bad news to that, though. The good news is that without leveraging the fundamentals of Scrum, which you have to leverage the fundamentals of Scrum. It doesn't matter what kind of configuration you're in. It doesn't matter what kind of scaled Agile platform you're in. If you're not well versed in the Scrum Guide, you're probably not going to be very successful in any scaled Agile configuration. Okay, I just want to make sure we're clear on that. The good news, though, is that if you're coming in to say from a traditional product owner role and you've just been listening to this podcast or you've had any other resources influence in your journey, you still may not do very well. I'm just kidding. You will, but there's going to be some consequences to the way that you've been doing business. All right, and there's going to be some consequences to your mindset. Because your mindset is, I'm coming in from this single thing, from this microcosm that really I'm kind of the master of the domain, so to speak. And now I'm coming in to play with a lot more folks, okay, and a lot more moving parts. So to make sure we're clear, the thing to remember here is that there's a lot of different teams. There's a lot of different releases. There's many influences, many decision makers that are all trying to come together and try to find the right way to work better. At least that's the goal. So some of your good habits, you're going to try to influence and put those on folks. Some of your bad habits will continue to get worse. And some of the things that you didn't know, but you thought you knew, could be a challenge. So we're going to jump into the next segment, and we're going to talk a little bit coming from that traditional Scrum into the SAFe model here. So hang tight. So I think the first thing to remember about coming from a traditional Scrum into SAFe is that you do have all of these other things going on at one time. all right, during any increment. So that might be a new word. A lot of times they use what they call a program increment, and organizations, most large organizations, are based off of like a quarter of a calendar year, for example, for an increment, maybe a semester for that increment, okay? Whatever it is, there's going to be some kind of time-boxed delivery schedule or a time where we're going to work, on the work that we're committed to. Much like you would find like in a time-boxed Scrum iteration, right, or a sprint. So during that increment, that's where we go in and we commit to some work that we think that we can get done over the next program increment. Sometimes you'll hear that as a PI, okay? Now, when we talk about that, we're talking about the idea, since it's scaled and we've got a lot of different moving parts and we got a lot of different contributors to this process now, we should be able to identify risk pretty early, right? That's kind of the way that it's set up. Now, I'm hoping that you're able to do that. I would say this, though, that I think that if you're unable to identify all of the risks, up front when we're doing our planning for this coming increment, I think that's kind of a second, that probably comes in second as far as biggest risk to running some kind of scaled agile framework like this, like SAFe. Identifying risk to me is just the second leading factor as to why you may not be as successful as what you would think. Anybody care to guess what the first one is? Remember what I said. You got a lot of different moving parts, a lot of different players. You got a lot of different contributors going into the fold here. You may have shared backlogs. So I'm trying to give you a hint now as to what the primary, the primary or the leading cause of not being successful is. If you guessed prioritization, you're right. See, now you're going into a world of prioritization by people who, truly believe that they know how to behave in these new roles, okay? Talk about those levels again. You're talking portfolio, program levels, because product owners tend to kind of get an idea of what prioritization means, right? The difference is, though, in your old world, prioritization was probably pretty easy to do because you had one or two, maybe even three sponsors or stakeholders. You had a pretty clear path to victory. You had a pretty easy way to get buy-in if you're able to see the path pretty clearly and get to the end or get to the definition of done, get to the finish line. So you kind of got to prioritize on your own in your own world. Now you're in a much different world. Now you are journeying to a world of enchantment and prioritization likely done by committee, okay? Oftentimes that's what it's like. I'm not saying it always is. There are systematic tools in there. I had mentioned the Wisdom that we talked about, the way that you can kind of plug in values and give business value and give cost of delay values and items like that, and things get calculated. And sometimes you have folks there who can game that system or game the systematic way of determining priority. Then you got some kind of amount of second guessing maybe if the right call was made. So that, in my opinion, is going to be one of the biggest adjustments for you if you're a product owner coming in from a single development initiative, a single project mindset, something like that. Going into SAFe is because you can still handle the prioritization of the work, right? And the prioritization of the items to some extent. You will definitely handle the prioritization of the commitments that you make. However, what you're actually going to be working on, lots of times you're not really going to be prioritizing that. You're really going to be kind of getting that fed into you from the pipeline, from the funnel of the larger program effort, okay? And that program effort comes from sponsors and stakeholders, of course, that trickle down through the portfolio to program level. And once that's ready for the team to pick up, the team should pick it up and go, right? Most of the work your team will be committing to will be from some kind of program backlog. And remember, that's thought to reside at the program level, not at the team level. Now, you're going to have your microcosm in your backlog, right, of the stuff that you're going to be working on. But your backlog refinement, daily grooming, share care time, all that stuff that we've talked about in the past, it still applies to you. but it's really only in your microcosm now, which is found at the team level. Now, I'd highly recommend that you keep a check on the program backlog, that full team, not team, but full train, I guess, program backlog. There's that word again. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. Not sure if the rules of your organization will allow you to groom that very much. Not sure what the method is there, but it's worth a shot to try to get in there and groom some of it. But lots of time in Scaled Agile, remember this, there's more teams than just yours working in there, okay? So you may not even get to do that work that you're grooming. Now, let's talk about how that impacts us here, and let's introduce this concept of a release train. That release train is the idea of taking all the sums of work, I guess, making a big conglomerate type, big body, aggregated type, big body of work now of software or of potentially shippable software that that's yielded from all of these little teams that are running in the Scaled Agile thing, and that makes up the release train. So that release train relies a lot on runway work, on technical enablers, on architectural things that precede, our work or maybe coincide with our work that have to get done in order for you to produce what it is that you want to produce. The idea there is that all of these teams are sometimes put together in relative measures of the kind of work that they would do, like a value stream. Sometimes they're put together in platform or suite or code base or solution or delivery or interface type. It just depends really on how you're set up and how you're structured. There's no real one way to do it. I mean, it really doesn't matter how you're putting it together. As long as you're working better, then you're winning, right? Now, let's go back to the backlog idea, though, for this release train. This release train this is kind of thought of as part of the runway, the technical, the architectural stuff, in addition to all the business stuff that you want to get done out of that larger program level backlog, not really team backlog yet, but program backlog, okay? If you go ahead of that and you start grooming some of that stuff, you've written seed stories or whatever for that thing, and then some other team ends up getting that work, that could be problematic, because they may not be having the same team language that you have, the same domain language. They might not have the same story writing approach that you do. And, a lot of times what you're going to find is when you're working more in what we call these features, that's the idea here, is that you're going to be the feature owner, essentially, as a product owner. Okay, more times than not, that's what your role is going to be. These features should be designed so that they're presented to a team in a ready-to-work state. So they should have a clear definition of done, and they should obviously be sliced in a way that your team can get it all done within one program increment. Now, with these features being now your babies, you have to take care of these features really well. What ends up happening in this, though, is that you have features that become dependent on other features. So managing this program level backlog is important for you, product owner, because you're always going to have a predecessor or a dependency that is in that program level backlog for what it is that you're trying to get done for the organization or for the customer. All right. Now, that's important to remember here, because as I go into this on some ways that you can help the organization, you can kind of inject what it is that you have learned from your skills and bring it over here. I'm going to jump into that in the next segment, probably. But the idea here, I will. I've already got it typed up. Anyway, you have to take care of these features, but you also have to make sure that your features are getting cleared, a clear path to victory, just like you would have in your single development initiative or your single project initiative, workflow, mindset, whatever it is that you've come from. So while these features are your babies, they have umbilical cords attached to them somewhere, for some runway work or something like that. So you have to make sure that you're staying in that program backlog to some extent to make sure that we're not doing work at level C first when we should be doing level B, but all of that's dependent on architectural runway work A. And all of that should be found in the in the program backlog. Okay? So these features, again, these are going to be typically tied to an epic. Typically, I'm not saying all the time. It may not be relevant to a strategic theme that's been recorded as an epic. okay? And that's fair sometimes, because sometimes you want to spawn your own thing. Team wants to come up with their own thing. Somebody else wants to come into their own thing. Cool, no problem there. But the idea is that there's no law against having more than one feature for one epic. In fact, that's probably best. It's because an epic really is a hypothesis statement. A feature is really some kind of expected outcome that we could deliver that we feel pretty strongly would move the needle for that epic. Does that make sense? The idea, though, is that about these features for you, product owner, is that you have to be an advocate for making sure that features are split properly, that they're sliced properly. That's what I would really like to make sure that you're capitalizing on here when you go into this new role or when you're working within SAFe. Here's why. It's because smaller features is the same as smaller batch sizes. We've talked about this, over and over again. This is one of the key ingredients, I guess, of having a successful Agile implementation. Think in terms of velocity and speed to market. Don't hold the customers hostage over something that somebody else just wants just because they want the whole enchilada. Now, let's rope this back to why I told you that prioritization is the Achilles heel of all of this. When you're holding customers hostage because you want them to have the whole thing and you're willing to trade off giving them the value now for half of it, right? A lot of times, and I'm just going to speak freely and honestly here, a lot of times the reason that that's done in a scaled Agile environment is because business tends to believe that if they don't get the whole thing in this feature, that we may never come back and finish that other piece of it. All right. Well, what is that a symptom of? That's a symptom of prioritization. If you really thought it was a priority to get that done, you would have it in the backlog to get done, and you wouldn't move other things up in priority, right? So it's about prioritization. You got to be an advocate for slicing and splitting these features in a way that makes sense and something that's deliverable within that program increment or PI, right? And you can't hold your customers hostage over something that, for just the whole full outcome, the big vision picture, right? You got to deliver value, and you got to deliver it pretty routinely, periodically, regularly. We hope that that's maybe a couple of times within a program increment, maybe a couple of 3 times within a program increment. Okay. So there's lots of things that you gotta know, and you gotta kind of keep an eye on in this new scaled and Agile atmosphere. There's a lot of moving parts, but fundamentally, your world, if you think about it, it just got condensed from a macrocosm in the sense of what you had purview over and what you had decision making over, into, from that macrocosm of your own into a microcosm of your own that's a part of a bigger thing. It's not all bad, okay? It's not all bad. We're going to get to the next segment, and what I want to do is help you with some opportunities from this in your transition here. So far we have kind of talked about the why. Why do we go to a scaled Agile? And what kind of that looks like and what it means and how it kind of operates a little bit on a high level anyway, and then give you some of the risks, because that's where my mind goes first, is what are the risks. That's what I don't know, my kids hate me because I always think of the risk first, and some of the things that you might be on the lookout for. And so now what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about some of the ways that you can become a trailblazer coming from your mindset of a single initiative type Scrum role or a Scrum Master or a product owner role, and going into a SAFe organization with more teams, more scaled Agile look and feel, okay? Wow, I was just looking at the time, and this thing is, we're already at like 30 minutes. This is going to be a super long episode, longer than normal. By the way, if you play this podcast on 1.5 times the speed, it's going to change your life. You probably already got that figured out because, remember, I'm from the South and I'm a little slow. Anyway, we're talking about committing to trailblazers, and I'm going to kind of get through this segment here. And if it's too much, then I may just cut this off, shut it down, and split up into another episode. But We'll talk about some high-level stuff here anyway. So commit to making your team the trailblazer. And what I mean by that is you're coming into an organization, all right? One thing you're going to start noticing when you're going into a safe modeled organization, coming from a single development or whatever, okay, the one thing that you're going to notice right off the bat is safe practitioners typically kind of throw the Scrum Guide out the window. All right, I'm saying that kind of tongue-in-cheek. I'm saying that kind of lightheartedly, but really, neglecting to read the Scrum Guide and follow that is really a problem. I mean, it's like epidemic. I mean, I've seen that a lot. I mean, I really think that a lot of organizational leaders just kind of get the buzzwords and they get sold on scaling Agile, and they forget that fundamentally the building block behind all of that stuff is more about Scrum and Kanban and some of these other XP type things and rapid application development or whatever it is, okay? And they get into the framework, and the framework gets stood up, and then people are just kind of thrown into these roles. And I've talked about that in another episode. But really, I know this is a shocker, okay? But, I want you to go back and listen to the episode that I have out there about frameworks, and you'll see what I mean when I say that. So one thing about coming from your environment, though, is you definitely have a leg up in that area. You're going to have a learning curve with who's who, what's where, and when we do what, and who does it. But all that stuff's just a matter of finding out where the ketchup is. It's like walking into a new restaurant, right? I mean, you're not going to know where the ketchup is, but you know how to do the rest of the stuff, right? So let's compare and contrast a little bit with what you may see in this new world order of SAFe. You're going to find that many people misinterpret SAFe guidance. Some Scrum Masters will insist that time equals points. Some team members will insist that your definition of done is driven by the platform or the program level, and typically that is not the case. Some people believe that business owners are non-essential employees. I knew I'd get to use the term non-essential worker here. But anyways, the business owner is not an essential role. Some folks are going to try to convince you that we can have business value without it being in the hands of customer. All the time. I see some very small cases for that. And again, I've got an episode on that. Some terminology is going to throw you for a loop because when you read it, you understand it, you test on it, and then you start researching how it's really done in application other than just the text in the book. Others may not perceive it that way. You're certainly going to find that some folks wear their certification badges on their shoulders, and be damned if you're going to tell them that they're wrong, okay? Because that's a big deal to get a cert. I understand that, and that's great, but the certification doesn't really mean that you still know what you're talking about, all right, or that you've actually put it in application. You're going to most certainly use, now you can mark my word on this one, you're going to most certainly use, actually, the term MVP. And you're gonna hear that overused, incorrectly used, abused. The term MVP is something that you go out and read it for yourself, and then you go in there and you find out what the application is and what the teams have agreed to the definition of that is, and then you tell me what you think. I'd love to hear from you. The next thing that I want to tell you, so you're going to hear some misinterpretations of the SAFe guide, the SAFe guidance. Okay. The next thing is you're going to have to watch your language. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Domain language and team are going to be really important to you here in this new world. You have to use terms, though, that are relative to the training and to the program. Otherwise, nobody's going to understand you. Does that make sense? I don't know if I shared with you on the last episode or not. I told you about my 9-year-old, she's really particular, really literal. I told her to go in and put her shoes on one day, and she said, she just kind of hung around back there in her room for a little while. And I said, hey, are you ready to go? You have your shoes on? And she said, no. And then finally she comes out after a few minutes and she says, I don't want to wear my shoes. I want to wear my sandals. Okay. So sandals, shoes, those are two different things to a 9-year-old. All right. And so the terms that you're going to use and the language that you're going to use are going to be really important. You have to use terms that are relative to the training, relative to the implementation of this program, because if you don't, nobody's going to understand you. Unfortunately, you're not going to rely on your previous experience with terms in a lot of cases here, but you can make them apply, like laterally, I guess, and just kind of change your mindset in it until you have your feet up under you well enough to challenge any of those other terms and definitions. Okay. So remember, you've got to realize too that everybody's on a different part of the journey. I already told you just a minute ago that half these people hadn't even read the Scrum Guide yet, maybe more. All right. And, we've said that. I want you to imagine a world where product owners, Scrum Masters, and teams only got training from a safe implementation guide and not from the Scrum Guide. Imagine that world for a minute when you walk into this new world order, okay? Use this to your advantage, though, and incorporate some new terminology into your domain and team language. You'll want to get a leg up on this for sure. You'll want to set the trend for the story writing techniques and the testing and the conditions of satisfaction. And I want you to remember to think enterprise. I've told you before, defend the enterprise, decrease support, right? We've talked about that, increase adoption. So whatever you can do to increase adoption, defend the enterprise, and decrease the need for support, then you're pretty much doing what you should be doing, okay? So those are some ways that you can definitely contribute right off the bat. And I would take advantage of that immediately. Do it your way. You know what I'm saying? If your way's been effective for all those years, and then teach people the curve, but make sure that you're kind of translating into domain language there for your new safe implementation. So now, we've covered a lot just in this one segment, but there are three things that I think you're going to want to make a note of here. Three things that I think are really important for you to be successful as a product owner in SAFe. And again, this is my opinion, okay? I'm giving you really good content. I'm just going to touch base on it because I really want to incorporate some of this into my paid-for content. But anyway, and I'm working on that. The idea, though, is that I'm going to brush over this for a little bit, and I want to let you think about it without me going into it really deeply. But again, I mean, that's what we're doing here, right? We're teaching thinking patterns for product owners, teams, Scrum Masters, organizational leaders. So here are the three keys, I think, for a product owner to be successful and SAFe. The first one is slice, and it's 3 S's, by the way. It just happens to be because my first name is Scott, and it starts with an S. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, so the first one is slice features into valuable, deliverable, complete work before you commit to them in your PI. Slicing features is really important. You want to make sure that the features are sliced properly, okay? And you as a product owner, you should have enough pull, so to speak, or enough of a voice to make sure that that's true. All right. Slice the features into valuable, deliverable, complete work before you commit to them in your PI. The second one, I think, is support the enterprise with everything you do. You know, just because it works for your team, just because it works for another team, just because it works for your platform, doesn't mean that it works for the whole platform. Remember, when you're scaling Agile, you're taking into consideration that there are all these different teams, all these different systems, all these different user interfaces, all these different client bases, all these different things going in, right? That's an enterprise. And you have to support what works for the enterprise. Because if you start doing it kind of your own way, you're going to throw a kink into all of that, and people upstream aren't going to buy in. Remember, we've talked about adoption being critical for a lot of these kind of transformations. And if you can't make it work for everybody, or if you can't be flexible enough or general enough in the way that the process flows or the work moves from left to right, or whatever, then you're going to break something and nobody's going to adopt into it. Okay, so support the enterprise. The final thing is speak up. So you want to slice features, you want to support the enterprise, but you want to speak up. You got to speak up about risks. You can't just nod and grin and say, yeah, we can do this. Remember, I told you before, we got to stop lying to people, okay? Speak up about risks. Speak up about dependencies. Speak up about values of features. You have to do these things. As a product owner, that's what you're there to do, right? I mean, you are maximizing the value of the team. You are setting priority. In a lot of cases, you are setting vision. We've talked about that in previous episodes. So you have to make sure that you're speaking up, okay? Particularly about risk, dependencies, and values of features. Okay, so slice features, support the enterprise, and speak up. Those are the 3 things. Now remember, I said the good news is that if you're coming into SAFe from a traditional product owner role and you've been listening to this podcast or you've had any other resources influencing your journey, I told you earlier, you may still not do very well. I'm just kidding, but you will. There's going to be some consequences. And so the important thing to remember is that you're no longer really working for yourself. I hate to even say it that way, but it's the truth. You have lots more stakeholders to deal with, many more risks because you got a much larger section of components that you're working with at this point. There are a few things that you got to know about the relativity of things in SAFe. First is that with all these other teams, from architecture to compliance to marketing to support, all down the lines, there's a lot of moving parts. Side note for you. Just to kind of give you an idea of where I'm going here. We recently bought a brand new car. Love this car. I really do love it. It'll drive on its own. I mean, it's like that's the neatest thing since, pay toilets. But there's so many different safety features on this thing and so many settings and controls. It's got all the works. Now, the problem with this for me is that I'm an old dog. I have an old pickup truck that doesn't have a lot of computer technology stuff in it. Okay, and there's a reason for that. It's because if that thing breaks, I can usually fix it. But if this new car that my wife wanted ever has an issue, I'm in big trouble. Because the more features you have, the more electronics you have, the more stuff, the more bells and whistles you have, the more support you have for it. Right? Does that make sense? So I want you to think about that as you go through this SAFe journey. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of people, processes, and tools. Now, the biggest thing I think that you can take from me about this new journey, and before I tell you about it, I want to remind you of it. Remember I told you all that one of the ways I describe the product owner is that you're constantly on a balance beam between technology and business, right? Meaning the customer in most cases, right? This is going to prove to be your biggest task. It's because I just told you about all the multiple systems, multiple owners, multiple users, multiple teams, multiple everything, all right? That's why you are scaling Agile, okay? So that means we've got a pretty big margin of error because there's more things to support, right? If things get off track, you've got a pretty big margin of error, right? So you have to get on that balance beam and you've got to keep your butt on it. I mean, you have to be able to build trust and relationships, particularly with technology. On both sides for sure, but particularly with technology, because you're going to almost always be dependent on their pre-work, their runway work, their architectural lead, whatever, and decision-making in a large organization. And, there's a way to handle all of their pre-work. They call it runway work, and you may have heard me use the term enabler early on in this podcast, or in this episode, rather. I recommend making sure that these enablers are cited clearly, early, and you won't be able to do that by yourself. You've got to have a technology partner with you, okay? Here's why I'm telling you. You're committed to the work for a program increment or a PI, they call it. You are on the hook. Your team is on the hook. Now, I've always said you can't control the outcome, but you can control your choices. You can choose to not be on the hook for that work, or you can choose to be on the hook for that work, okay? If you get your stuff rolling and then you find out there's no architectural runway, or there's no database space left there, or there's no service or call or something to hook into, and that's not coming until the next PI or toward the end of the year or whatever, that's no good. You're not going to be able to deliver like that. So go ahead and get that share care time with your technology partner, as I hope you are already doing with your primary sponsor or stakeholder peep. Okay? Now, I will tell you, good luck getting on their calendar, but just make sure you're always trying to stay proactive, okay? And it doesn't have to be maybe weekly with these guys. It could be weekly, it could be bi-weekly, it could be bi-monthly, it could be monthly. It doesn't matter. The idea, though, is you want to get on their calendar and talk about it. So you have those skills already if you're taking away any of the thinking patterns that I have laid out for you thus far in your journey on Planet Product Owner. So you already got this covered, okay? So those are some things that I think will help you be more successful in a SAFe configuration, as opposed to coming from your single development or single initiative type role as being a product owner. So finally, thank God, let's get off this crazy planet today. So moving from a basic Agile or Scrum environment can be difficult, depending on how the organization is implementing it, obviously. But if the organization claims that they have already implemented it, or we are SAFe, Agile, we are done, that's probably a red flag to me. That means they're not really committed to inspecting and adapting philosophies. The trouble is that a lot of times you just read a book, you get a cert, add some processes to become the product, and you already know how I feel about that. The process has to improve the product. It can't be the product, okay? Your journey will take a turn with Scaled Agile, particularly with SAFe. You just got to realize that roles are a little more streamlined than what you're used to. It's a little bit more segmented. You have to defend against handoffs a lot, okay? Because the spirit of collaboration still has to exist, right? I mean, that's fundamental. And again, If you're not reading the Scrum Guide or practicing that, then you're probably way behind already. The thing to remember is that you're going to have within those streamlined roles, you had a much more intimate feeling in your old position in non-safe world. And what I mean by that is control. Okay. But the thing to remember is that once a wheel of this size of an organization committed to scaling Agile gets going on the right track, that's really hard to stop, and it can be really effective. There are a lot of wins that are out there for you, potentially, as long as everybody's on the same page, using the same domain language, working towards the same goals, identifying risks, and taking care of prioritization. I mean, those are the fundamental things, okay? You just got to make sure that you're not getting frustrated with issues with the prioritization or grooming for that matter. And you have to focus on building the best team in the organization. Do your part. Continue to add value, work with others for the good of the enterprise, the good of the greater good, right? Make sure your inspect and adapt is taken seriously. That's important. That's the real way to improve. And remember, you're always on the journey, and so are they. All right? I love questions from the listeners. I would love to have you subscribe and tell your friends, tell everybody about it. Key me up to come in and speak or to do a webcast or whatever. I'm up for that. Just let me know how I can help you guys. I love to hear from you, and I would obviously love for, you guys to continue contributing. That would be great. So until next time, have a safe, fun, lean journey, my friends.